Friday new lecture series. I'm Lindsay. I teach ceramics here and organize this program. Thank you, Robin. And I'm really excited to introduce our speaker and workshop leading artist today, Ethan Meyer. Ethan graduated with his BA from Webster in 2013. He's a painter and fiber artist and currently the director of Dwayne Reed Gallery. Ethan he exhibits his work, and his work is held in collections both internationally and nationally. He has a really robust studio practice, and I've known him for about a decade with your work at Dwayne Reed Gallery. I'm really excited to hear him speak about his own studio practice here today. A brief little note, this is supported by a grant from the Regional Arts Commission, so in that regard, we have a brief survey for our grant reporting. If you would feel so inclined to fill out those questions afterwards, there'll be a QR code that will show up. And now it's my pleasure to give it to Ethan.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for inviting me here to speak in front of you all. Just let me know if I need to project more, if the volume's good and everyone can hear. So I'm going to try to aim for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to some questions and answers. So if anything that I say during my rambling is of notable interest, feel free to ask a question related to anything. So other than that, I'm just going to kind of give you a little survey of from my time from graduation to now. And it's kind of hard to believe that it's been over 10 years since I was a student here. And so in that time, post-graduation, trying to figure out what it is that I wanted to do with my career in the arts, and kind of finding my way, because you go to school and you learn a whole bunch of different things and processes, and then you're kind of let go to make sense of it as you can on your own. And so one of the things that I feel very strongly about in my art practice is a sense of fun and a sense of play when I'm working. And I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of artists in my time over the years working at the gallery. And Dwayne Reed Gallery, we exhibit all mediums, so ceramics, painters, mixed media, glass artists. Dwayne became a pretty well-known part of the local art community in his representation of Dale Chicouli in the 90s and early 2000s. And then he expanded from primarily glass into ceramics, and we've shown notable artists such as June Kaneko. And so getting the opportunity to work for a gallery that shows such caliber of material, that was hugely beneficial to me coming into my own creatively. And I would say that in terms of really feeling a strong connection to a mature body of work is something that took a while. I don't think I really started making work that I felt good about until probably 2 or 3 years post-graduation. And so I look back at my time as a student, and I see it as all mainly a process of exploration and discovery. And there's always the temptation as an artist to kind of take your work so seriously, and not to say that you shouldn't, but it's really easy to fall into a place where you feel pressure and expectation more than you feel kind of the joy and spontaneity in creativity itself. And so I just want to kind of focus on kind of what I view as some core philosophical tenets that I approach art making with. So going back to the first slide, so this was the kind of work in the background there. This was a mural that I did in a retail shop in West County around 2013, 2014. And while I was a student here, most of my work was kind of in this sort of what was referred to at the time as pop surrealism. So there were a lot of artists, particularly in California, that were doing this sort of whimsical style. And this was kind of the jumping off point for me creatively. And then as I kind of further explored what I was doing with painting at the time, because I had not yet gotten into sculpture so much, or the fiber material that now is kind of the focus of my studio practice, I started kind of pushing the kind of the cartoon character elements and the whimsical elements further and further into a purely abstracted canvas. And so with this sort of process of continuous evolution in your creative practice, there's a need to understand that you are going to be approaching your creativity uniquely from your own standpoint, and it requires a patient and considerate understanding of this evolution occurring at your own pace. And so when especially artists approach their work from the standpoint of exhibiting at the gallery level, showing at institutions and museums, selling your work and being placed into collections, there is a trap that artists can fall into pretty easily, where there's the continuous pursuit of validation at the expense of being satisfied with what you're making and how you're making it. So one should always take priority, and in my opinion, the priority should always be in your enjoyment of your own studio practice, because at the end of the day, it's you who you're making your work for. You are the primary audience of your own work. And so it's really important that you maintain that core satisfaction with your creativity. And then going into, the part of being an artist that involves filing tax returns and keeping things organized at the back end in kind of a business office capacity. And being an artist is a job, and it doesn't really matter if you're trying to show at a blue chip gallery, or if you just want to be a part of the arts community and exhibit at the local level. It is a job, but it is one that you should enjoy. And so it can feel very intimidating. I know that it was intimidating for me, kind of like figuring out like how to structure my taxes and thinking that, I made one sale for $300 and I'm going to get audited by the IRS because I did something wrong. So there's a learning curve to all of this, and it is a process of, once you kind of familiarize yourself with these sorts of things, it can feel less daunting, and ideally, as you kind of find your way through the professional aspect or the minutia of keeping what is essentially a small business organized, as you find yourself more comfortable with what you're doing, it should kind of free up space for you to be able to approach your work from a place of authenticity, and not be so maniacally concerned with all the fine details. So one of the things that I've had the unique privilege of being exposed to during my time working at an art gallery is artists from every stage of maturity in terms of not only a studio practice but a business, and being overly concerned with what their goal is. And you should always have goals, and goal setting is an important part of being an artist. But again, going back to the first point of making sure that you are deeply satisfied with your process and not letting the need for that pursuit or goal seeking to come at a cost or a large enough cost where it compromises your ability to enjoy what you're doing. So one thing that is kind of funny is that you would think at a certain part in the professional side of being an exhibited artist that you would, you know, from your perspective as a student right here, right now, you know, imagining yourself, you know, showing at the gallery level and being placed into collections. Those things, once you accomplish them, there's always something else that's slightly beyond your reach that then becomes the next fixation. And so I see artists and I interact with artists whom we represent who are just profoundly talented people, and not all of them, but some of them are just unfortunately deeply unhappy because there's always something that they don't have yet that they're allowing to be, you know, kind of eat your lunch, as they say, and it's just, that is something that you want to do your best to try to avoid. And so there's this kind of fine balance to be had between being ambitious, because being a professional artist takes a lot of ambition to even pursue, much less accomplish. And so there's always this need to remind yourself, like, why you are really doing it and what's it all for, because at the end of the day, there's, you know, plenty of other artists to compare yourself to and to kind of diminish your own accomplishments. And so I think it's also important to, at every stage, really reflect on what you have accomplished and really not diminishing those things, and keeping in mind that there will always be another hill to conquer. So in my transition to being a fiber artist, and I use that category lightly. I kind of more align myself with a mixed media sculpture category. And the reason for that is there's a very rich history in fiber and fine craft, and a lot of areas of work in the broader contemporary art market. More recently, we've come into a place where things like glass and fiber are considered to be contemporary art or fine art in a proper sense, whereas previously, and not that long ago either, things of that nature were seen as kind of, you know, that's craft, that's not fine art. And there was this very hard distinction between, you know, what was considered fine art and what's not. And so within the fiber movement, there is a lot of skill and tradition of which I benefit from, but I do not have a part in sculpting or pushing that medium forward. So out of respect for the artists who did lay that foundation for me to be able to make the work that I'm currently making, that's why I kind of more aligned with the mixed media sculpture category. But so the process of coming into working in this material, from being primarily a painter, I've always kind of dabbled a little bit in sculpture. It was always something that I was curious about, but it wasn't something that I really threw myself headfirst into until I started working at Dwayne Reed Gallery, and that journey for me began in 2015, which is when I began my employment there. And the thing that changed the most for my own studio practice was just being exposed to all sorts of work that previously I was completely unaware even existed. And so that's another thing about being an artist, is that there will be things that excite you, that really animate you, and that you are just naturally passionate about in you know, your favorite artists or your favorite pieces of artwork. But there's going to be an equally important realm of work that you have not considered. And for me, one of those aspects was in this sort of mixed media craft, fine craft world, and it was encountering the work of Sheila Hicks for the first time that really got me thinking about my work in a different way, and also in what it could become. Sheila worked primarily in the 60s and 70s, and so the majority of her career was during a time where what she was doing wasn't considered fine art. And so she came, when you don't have the categories and the titles of being, you're a fine artist, so to speak, it kind of gives you more freedom to explore your process. And so her work, instead of focusing on, the technical aspect, and her work does have a technical side to it, but it was kind of approached in more of a kind of spirit of almost an abstract expressionist quality. And so I encountered her work originally, I believe it was at an art fair. I think it was in Miami, but one of the other dealers that was showing at the fair had this piece about this size, and it was on a pedestal, and it just it was like a magnet. I just, what's that? and just it drew me in, and just it captivated me, and I just started thinking okay, well, there's something here. I feel like I could explore this, and so the way it started for me, and this relates to the bullet point of following your inspiration into the unknown, because I had no clue what I was doing. I wasn't trained in the manufacturing process, and all I kind of had was my natural intuition as an abstract painter, a colorblind abstract painter, and so the process of coming into your own as an artist, it expands the scope of what you believe your work can become. And it is a process of kind of hurling yourself into the unknown, because even if you work in a representational capacity, or you work within a field or medium that has some very hard ingrained process to it, such as like ceramics or printmaking, where there are more rules applied to the process just due to the physicality of the medium itself. You can kind of get lost in the weeds of, if I'm firing this sort of clay body, it has to be at this, particular cone temperature. Otherwise, it's going to break in the kiln or something like that. But once you, again, become intimately familiar with these processes, then you can start to kind of widen the scope of what your work can become. And so I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the show Adventure Time, but the quote, "Sucking at something is the first step towards being kind of good at something," I really take to heart, because it is a process, and you have to be comfortable with not knowing what you're doing and kind of going out on a limb and allowing yourself to be vulnerable in a creative sense. Because ideally, we all want to make things that we feel proud of, that we want to show people, but there's plenty of things that you make and you're like, I learned from this experience, and now it's going to be put into a closet and never see the light of day. And that's a very valuable part of the creative process. I mean, you need those experiences to become a well-informed creative force in your own right. And so the place that I've currently arrived at in my creative practice, in my studio practice, is this dual body of work that one informs the other. So there's this kind of feeling like everything's painting to me, because painting is kind of the doorway I walked in through to understand creativity broadly. So whenever I'm making a sculpture or engaged with fiber, it feels like I'm painting the material. So it's more of a metaphor for how I approach creativity, and you'll find your own way. That doesn't mean that you have to like if you just are all about one particular mode of creativity and you don't really have a strong desire to, you know, go into a completely different body of work, that's fine, but it just kind of, and the more you know and the more you see, the more you can kind of imagine what the work can become. So that's kind of the main thing that I want to get across, is how learning in one area strengthens everything else across the board. So the like the compositional choices that I make whenever I'm putting together a 2D fighter work, it has natural carryover into my paintings and vice versa. So there's just a really exciting process of this sort of back and forth communication. And not only that, but when you have a deeper insight into your own work, and that knowledge translates and carries over to how you approach other people's creativity. And then everything is information coming in and distilling and being able to be applied then to other areas. And so I would not have come to this place within my own creativity had I not been exposed to so much work. Museums and other galleries and art fairs, and just working in the field, you see a literal overwhelming amount of artwork. There was one year that Dwayne and I went down to Miami for Art Basel, and we were there as spectators, so we didn't have a booth to work. So our agenda was just, you know, in the 5 days that we were down there, trying to go to literally as many of the fairs as we could. And at that time in particular, I think there was Basel, the main event, but I think there was like 10 or 12 satellite fairs. So we went to as many as we could, and there's this very interesting thing that happens when you literally look at more work than your eyes can digest. You're bombarding your senses with all this visual stimuli and trying to make sense of it. And when you're approaching it from the standpoint, or more of a dual standpoint of, you know, I'm here because I work for a gallery, and assessing the work that I'm looking at from the curatorial eye, and also the eye of, you know, selling the work and trying to think of how to approach it in a commercial capacity, but then also this, you know, natural curiosity of just like, how did they make that? And like, what's going on here? Or encountering something that's truly like unique and surprising. It's just, I mean, we've all had those moments of seeing something so profoundly inspiring that you just want to, you know, run to the studio and just drop everything else you had going on that day and just like bury yourself in the studio and making things because of how inspired you became from encountering it. So going back to this notion of creativity being this kind of universal force that is equally applicable across all areas, and how through interrogating and discovering new aspects of your process, you're able to then gain deeper insights into your work broadly. So, let's see. Reference my notes really quick. So I'm speeding through my presentation, but
Do you know who Miyamoto Musashi is?
yeah. So he was a swordsman and philosopher. I forget in which century he existed, but this quote's always resonated with me because it kind of goes to this sort of universal maxim in how you do anything is how you do everything, and how like everything's kind of nested within everything else. And if you approach your creativity from that perspective, and you know, this sort of open-ended process where there's no real wrong way to be creative, And that's something that's really important to kind of hone in on, because if your primary concern is with the market, the art market that is, and what's acceptable and what's not, and what will sell and what won't, that's a really bewildering place for an artist to be, because you know, those questions are relevant and they're worth asking, but they won't guide you into a deeper connection with your own work and your creativity if you align yourself primarily from the perspective of, okay, well, what will sell? You know, there are artists who make it their business to know what will sell, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's kind of fundamentally, it's a different pursuit. And so, kind of approaching it as everything's connected and it's all kind of one whole, and if you have deep insight into one area, you can apply that broadly across the board, is something that I think is fun to tinker with at the very least. And so the work that I make, I wouldn't describe as being serious in the sense that that I take myself seriously. I do, in a creative capacity, take the work that I'm making very seriously, but there's also this sort of tongue-in-cheek sense of humor. The title of this piece is "I have no clue what I'm doing, but I think I'm having a good time," and so that's the sort of personality that I want to imbue my work with, because no one has it fully figured out with anything, in terms of life, in terms of art. We're all trying our best to kind of figure it out as we go, and hopefully gaining insights to where we can kind of compare notes with other people and help each other learn along the way. Because, you know, I've had the distinct privilege of getting to know a lot of extremely talented artists who are in very advanced stages of their career field, and I get to spend time with them and talk with them and see how their minds work and see what their priorities are. And the ones who are all about, you know, is the work selling? Is the work selling? If it's not, oh no, what's wrong? These sort of, like, you'll never get beyond self-doubt in the sense of, you know, no amount of success, no amount of money will make that inner voice that is like, well, are they gonna like it? What if they don't like it? What if nothing sells? What if the show's a flop? That voice never goes away, and so really it's important to not try to defeat that inner voice, but try to make it your ally and more of like a creative partner. And so, you know, there will always be financial concerns, and there will always be logistical concerns and studio expenses, but that doesn't have to be the primary force that rules your studio practice. And kind of taking it back to the beginning is that if you stay with this sort of core inspiration of, I'm doing it for me first and foremost, and I'm doing it because I enjoy it, and then it becomes something that's complementary to every other aspect of your life, and it doesn't have to be this sort of separate thing that only exists in the studio or only exists whenever you're feeling inspired. And creativity broadly can be this thing that you hold with you always, and it's always working in some capacity. So, going back to this idea of just really steeping yourself in the art world and having these moments where you get to experience another person's creativity and how deeply informative those moments are to your own studio practice. There have been unexpected moments I've had in museums where, you know, you're in town for a fair, or you're, you know, going to see a collector that you have business dealings with, and you're like, okay, well, I'm in town, I'll stop by the museum and see what's, you know, see what the shows are. And going into some exhibition that, you know, profoundly impactful and moving you to tears because of how beautiful something is. And everyone owes it to themselves to have those moments, to be vulnerable with another person's creativity, and how deeply transformative those moments can be. And the more moments you have like that, the better artist you will become. And it's just, that is, I can't stress that enough, because the more you know and the more you experience, both visually and in kind of a deeper capacity, almost we could say there's a spiritual component to art making and creativity that is life affirming and life enhancing. So the experience and the process of being an artist, it can be approached as a sort of means to an end, or, you know, I'll be happy when I show a Gagosian, you know. And so if you tell yourself that, you know, maybe you will show a Gagosian one day, but if you've made this sort of bargain beforehand of like, I'm not going to enjoy what I'm doing until I get to this very specific place, because those needs of validation and getting the next trophy, so to speak, it's an endless process. And so you'll be much more satisfied with your creativity if you engage with it in an open-ended experience. And then this sort of notion of continuous evolution, that the current perspective that you have on your work is just the one that you currently hold, and it's always open to change and to evolve in ways that you've not presently considered. Whenever I was in high school, you know, I was very self-conscious of my color blindness, and so I never used color, and I didn't really even imagine that I would ever be a painter, or much less a fiber artist. And then whenever I kind of became more familiar and comfortable with the use of color, you know, I wanted to be a good painter, and I never even considered at the time that I'd be making kind of work that, you know, these weird amorphous life-size sculptures. And this is currently the main focus of my studio practice, and wanting to see them get larger and to grow. I mean, they take a long time to complete. The one that I'm currently working on now is over 2 years in progress, and will be debuted this fall at Dwayne Reed Gallery. But it's just, you cannot, it's kind of amazing that you can be involved with something and still have a complete mystery in front of you in terms of what it's going to become. And so this sort of continuous evolution is complementary to the perspective of viewing being a creative person, being an artist, as a journey with no particular destination, and you're just experiencing it as it unfolds. So, you know, you need to ground yourself in something, but it's kind of like being free of all the concerns with day-to-day life, and kind of finding refuge in creativity as this sort of safe haven where you can really be open and vulnerable with yourself. And so lastly, and then we'll open it up to some questions and answers. So whenever I came here as a student, it was because I knew I liked art, and I wanted to continue doing it. But beyond that, I didn't have a plan. And through a series of fortunate occurrences, I got to know Dwayne, my current employer, and he's been my primary mentor for almost a decade now. And through working at the gallery, I've come to realize that the arts community, not just within St. Louis, but nationally and even internationally, is actually a very small and interconnected community. And if you want to see yourself become an active part of this network, you just really need to take the time to go to galleries and openings and talk to the artist and talk to the dealer, but in an authentic capacity, because this is also a field where there's kind of an expectation that the doors can be opened for you, but you just gotta, show the person, like, I know I'm interrupting your lunch right now, but I've got these images of my work on my phone, and if I could have 2 minutes of your time. And, because that comes from a place of nervousness and self-doubt, where you think that you need to take every opportunity as an opportunity to self-promote. And really, if you just kind of approach it from a genuine place of wanting to be a part of a community, that's going to get you a lot further, because it really is a small world. And I know that my time here did do, it had a pretty significant role in where I am now, because whenever Dwayne and I first met each other, we weren't at all familiar with one another, but he knew a lot of the faculty here that knew me, and that connection was able to be made. And so, you're part of a special and small community that translates more broadly than I think most people consider as a student. So that is my presentation, and so now we'll have some Q&A time. Hey, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. That was great to hear about all this stuff. I mean, I think you spent some time attacking a lot of problems, or let's say like roadblocks,
Yeah.
that a lot of us hit, And I liked how you kept it kind of like the bigger, artist journey in a way. I was thinking about like individual pieces. I see a lot of students and a lot of artists visualizing the end result and then doing everything they can to get that end result. And then when it doesn't meet up with what they visualized, they can't find that same satisfaction or validation. And I think academia is probably the problem. But a lot of your textile works, the sculptural works, they really look like, kind of like what you talked about philosophically. They had a very broad path, but the work kind of created itself along this line of you being open to where it was moving and trying to follow it as it moved, maybe. And so, is that how you see your textile works like coming together?
Yeah, great question. And so this is just kind of how I approach creativity, and I don't mean to dictate as like this is the one and only true way of doing things, but for my work, I kind of view myself as like a conduit almost to manifest into the material realm things that already exist. And I know that it gets kind of woo-woo out there, sort of existential, philosophical thought, but that's kind of how I approach it, and it's complementary to being an abstract artist because it doesn't have to be necessarily grounded in anything real. So kind of imagining myself as just kind of the channel by which these things come into the physical realm. Because I do kind of see the paintings as kind of like portals into another world, and the sculptures are things that exist in this other dimension that come out of those portals. So there's the ability with being an artist to kind of create this sort of broader mythology that you embed yourself in. and kind of self-mythologize this sort of practice and why you do it and what you're trying to accomplish. And you know, one of the great things about creativity is you make the rules. You're engaging with something that's very unique and intimate. So you can approach it, and you don't necessarily need to justify what you're doing in a lot of important sounding words. That's also a skill that needs to be honed, but at the end of the day, yeah, you make the rules. Yeah?
I sometimes have a hard time, like, sometimes I try to get back into art, but at the same time, I sometimes lose motivation, and sometimes it's hard for me to try and create things, and I'm either getting distracted or just like, you know, what I can do is like make it art.
Yeah.
So, do you have any advice on what I should do on that? What I should do on that?
Yeah, I mean, and this
Can
is
you
kind
repeat
of...
the question, please?
Hmm?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so it's, and correct me if I'm misrepresenting what you just asked, but it's kind of this struggle with getting into the flow of creativity and making it this sort of effortless process, because, you know, making things is hard enough, and if you're struggling to kind of get traction with what this sort of deeper inspiration is of what you're trying to pursue, it can really disrupt the whole process. And so how I would answer that question is making it about, and I'm not trying to sound silly here, but making it about having fun. And if you're deeply satisfied and connected with the process and not necessarily the end result, so kind of going back to this sort of experimental, just like we're having fun here, and it doesn't need to be anything really. It doesn't need to become, you know, this, you know, your magnum opus or the best thing you've ever made or something that you even want to show anyone. It can just be for you, and kind of taking the pressure away from like, I have to be creative, or I have to be creative in this way, or I have to make the creativity result in something productive. If you kind of take away those self-imposed expectations and just kind of act on these sort of creative impulses, and whether that creative impulse is something that takes like 5 minutes to get out, or you find yourself kind of lost in the flow state for hours and hours, it's really, it's a win either way, is how I would say. So just kind of engage with creativity when you feel inspired and when it happens, and not to say that it has to result in anything in particular. Yeah.
I noticed how you talked a lot about, like you were just saying in that last answer too, like having a sense of fun and play while working. But I'm sure, like all of us, like you definitely get some frustrations. And like, what do you do when you find yourself in, like, do you like notice it coming, or is it just like kind of like more of like, what do you do in that situation?
Another great question. So, along with being colorblind, I'm a bit on the attention deficit spectrum. And so whenever I kind of feel like either I'm running into obstacles creatively, or I'm just not quite getting what it is that I'm reaching for me at least, it's really helpful to just switch gears. And what that usually looks like in my studio is I'll have like 5 paintings and 3 sculptures going on in various stages of progress, that it's just like, I just, you know, oh, I worked on this one for 15 minutes, I'm gonna work on this one for 10 minutes, and it's this constant kind of like a shuffle or a dance where you're just kind of like, and new thing, and just kind of keeping it fresh and keeping the creative juices flowing in a way that just, that feels natural for you specifically. And so for some people, they, you know, who don't have a attention deficit, you know, maybe it's best for another person to just really bury themselves in one piece and have a sense of linear progress to kind of keep them guided. But for me, I just kind of bounce all over the place. I mean, whenever I'm painting, go back to this one. So whenever I'm painting, I'll have the canvas up on the wall, and then I'll put it down on the floor, and then I'll turn it around, and then I'll stand up and look at it, and then, it's like I'm constantly changing how I'm approaching the canvas, because it is this, really at the end of the day, the compositions are just a swirling miasma of color and pattern. And for me, it works. And so really, it's kind of that sort of intuitive process of kind of figuring out how it works best for you. Yep.
So I have two questions.
Mhm.
One is, I know the colorblind is the spectrum of
Yeah.
how much you can see. I was just wondering, are you full colorblind or red and green colorblind or?
That's a good question. So as far as I'm aware, I have blue-green deficiency, which is, to the best of my ability to articulate. So I can see color, but because of the cones and in my eye and perceiving the spectrum of light that you translate as color, I'm missing the ability to see particular sections of the electromagnetic spectrum. So I can see blues and purples, but I can't see all the blues and all the purples. So there's this sort of area where colors become ambiguous, and I'll get them confused with each other. So but that happens with all sorts of colors. And so that's why I kind of rely on this sort of intuitive process as kind of the guiding force behind my creativity, because at least in the way that I work, nothing is planned. It's only kind of this improvisational sort of responding to decisions I just made. So in the color selection, that's how I'm able to articulate certain palettes, is just kind of responding to what I feel led to using, and not, I want to be well-versed enough in color theory, but I tend to not overthink it. So it works, it's not going to work the same way for everyone, but if I just kind of turn that part of my brain off and just let my hands just kind of move freely, that tends to give me the best results.
I recently read a really simple definition of experimental art and writing, which is work that doesn't know what it's going to be till it's done. Yeah?
Yeah.
And I think you've talked about that wonderfully all through this presentation. And you seem very, very dedicated to that sort of idea that you don't, even if you think you know what the destination is, you're going to find out in the process of getting there that you don't know, right? And I think it's been a wonderfully practical talk, especially for young artists to hear. I've been in the art world for 50 years, and I would agree with everything you've put up on the board. That's really, really good. So I would just like to hear, how did you make the decision, I thought of a better way to put it. What was the satisfaction for you of deciding to paint with textiles, to paint with colored material, rather than colored whatever paint is, colored clay or stuff?
Well, it's a great way of phrasing it, because I would say that it really goes back to encountering Sheila Hicks's work, and that just in how I experienced the work, it felt to me in viewing it, it felt like painting. It felt like something that was native and that I understood in just how she was using the materials. And it was exciting to me, and there will be moments you have where sometimes you come into a state of appreciation of another artist's work because of just how incredible it is, and you can't even imagine how they arrived at this process or how they were able to articulate this or that. And then there's the other side of inspiration where it inspires you and it touches on this deep level because it feels like something intimately familiar to you, like it's something that you've encountered before, maybe in a previous life or something like that.
Yes.
And so I remember after I got home from that particular work trip where I saw her material for the first time, I had this big bag of clothes I intended on donating to Goodwill, and because I'm a procrastinator, I just, was just sitting on the floor in the corner. So I got some old t-shirts out, and I just started kind of tearing the material into strips, and I just started kind of working with the materials and knotting them together and braiding them, and just kind of just playing with the material. And for me, it just kind of felt like the same way that I would approach a canvas and how I would make decisions on composition and color selection. And so that's just, for me, kind of how it happened. But great question, because it is something that's kind of hard to articulate at moments.
I think your focus has been on creativity rather than on art. Like you're sort of emphasizing that what the artist is about doing is figuring out how to be creative, not how do I meet the expectations that the art world is asking me to meet, including our professors.
I'll answer some other questions, but really quick to that point, for me, and this is just how I choose to approach it. For me, it's all part of the same whole, and so we kind of live in a golden age of an understanding and acceptance that anything can be art. We don't have the same obstacles that previous generations did of what's art and what's not, and why is it art and why is it not. And especially with work that was previously deemed craft and not fine art, the fact that we can have the privilege of approaching everything and anything as art if we choose for it to be that for us, I think that's when you're able to kind of come full circle and go back to the origin of just what does a creative impulse mean for you personally. You had a question?
How do you deal with the pressure of being successful in the art field? Because I know me personally, I'm spending all this time and money to learn these skills, and it's what I really want to do. I'm really passionate about it. But there's also that pressure of, will I be able to make this a career?
Right. So there's no real easy way of answering that question, because there is a lot of pressure, and especially when it comes down to financial concerns or making the most of your education. If you, along with your pursuits and your goals, which you should have, if you just kind of keep your creativity and your interest in art in general as kind of this thing that is deeply personal and that no one can ever take away or compromise, is the things that you find inspiring are the things that you find inspiring, and that, I mean, it's a beautiful thing that you should just cherish and keep close to you, because whether or not you're successful as an artist or in the art broadly as a career field, you'll always have some level of concern over making it or getting the job or getting the interview or selling the piece. Those concerns will always be present. They never really stop. I guess to answer your question more directly is, as you kind of go through life and you navigate these things, you find ways of kind of approaching them in a more constructive fashion. And so it's part of your own personal journey as an artist, as a creative person, and in your career field. So it's just something that kind of have to allow yourself to explore without any sort of preconceived notion of what success means necessarily, because I started working at the gallery. It wasn't something I ever planned on doing. It was just kind of an opportunity that presented itself. And I started off as an intern. I started off as a part-time weekend, just kind of you know, body sitting in the chair at the desk, not necessarily even an important role at the gallery. And it was just over the years in this kind of natural progression of just, it kind of became something that I was meant to do. And I think that everyone has the opportunity to find their particular calling, and it's a process of discovery, and it can be exciting as well as being something that's intimidating. But it should be exciting, and you know, if you use the things that are exciting to you as kind of your guiding light, like that's just kind of like you follow it like your North Star, more or less. Any other questions? Jeff?
Well, I just have a comment.
Yeah.
First of all, I completely agree with Chris. I think this is a wonderful presentation. And I think for the circumstances of speaking mostly to students is really a wonderful thing. And to add to what you just asked, you said that exactly in how you proceed. One of the ways that you proceed is by being involved with the arts.
Exactly.
Whether it is you're sitting in the studio and trying to sell the thing, you're involved with the arts as all of your professions.
Right.
I think that's really important. But my comment was your final slide, the summation slide. I mean, if I had anything to say in classes repeatedly, I think you've said it all there.
Yeah.
See art.
Yeah.
It's a small world. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I appreciate you saying that, and I can tell you exactly what the moment was that led me to working at the gallery and it becoming, you know, my my professional career path was I graduated from Webster and I was working a dead-end retail job, and circumstances changed with that job and I ended up quitting without having any other employment lined up. And so I was just kind of in this place of like, okay, well, you know, I've got student loan payments, I gotta find a job doing something somewhere. So I was detailing cars in West County, and I knew that I wanted to steer the direction towards what I was passionate about. And so I sent a letter of interest along with my resume to every gallerist in the area, and Dwayne was the only person to reply to me, which is kind of funny because it was meant to be, because it just so happened that he was looking for a part-time person, and you know, this is kind of like a field where you kind of want to ease into things. Like it can feel really high stakes at times. So the fact that I was looking for kind of another part-time position to complement detailing cars, and I wasn't looking to be, you know, the director of the gallery on day one, kind of was like, all right, well, you know, you can come in on Saturdays. And then the more Dwayne and I got to know each other, then he gave me an opportunity. He took me to Chicago for SOFA, which was the sculptural art, or sculptural object functional art fair that occurred every year at Navy Pier. It's the biggest show, the most expensive show that the gallery participated in annually. And that was my opportunity to see if I could sell work or not. And I ended up selling a piece, and so that went well. And then I was offered a full-time position, and so I went from part-time to assistant director, and then eventually director, and then 10 years later. And so, but I would have never gotten to the place where I currently am had I not pursued what it was that I knew I wanted to be a part of. And I didn't have any preconceived notion on what it meant to be a part of the arts community, just that I wanted to be there and be in the same room.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.